Okay, so you'll notice the way I set up these parameters for these API actions. I actually don't want to go about doing it like this. This is not how a web API is really supposed to be made. I put these kind of parameters in here for illustration purposes. You'll also notice that I have this Boolean return value type, which we will also be changing. So in the spirit of what we did before with our launcher and our client controllers, where we're returning our latest client results as just straight up C# classes, what I want to do is the same thing. I effectively want to create 4 classes here. I want to create the input class and the output class for each one of these actions, for both validate credentials and for generate token. And they'll be used to have the launcher be able to understand what the response of those actions were. So I shouldn't have scoped into buzzmmo.web because I need to go into base, API v1, and I'm going to add a couple classes. Now these classes are very similar to the concept of a view model that we might do in ASP.NET MVC, but instead we are creating them as classes up in our base project so that they're shared by both the launcher and the website, making communication between the two things very easy, as opposed to having to weakly type a bunch of stuff and use dynamic typing or use JObject or whatever weakly typed API you could use. So we really want to strongly type our API, and we do that by providing an input class and an output class for all of our things, except for things where that isn't possible, of course. So in API v1, I'm going to go ahead and create a class, and I'm going to say, how about auth validate credentials, or just how about auth validate, because validate is the name of my my route. So auth validate request. Now the auth validate request class will have a string username and a string password. Both of these will be set to properties with private setters, and they will also both be annotated by a required attribute, which I don't actually think is going to be possible to do now that I think about it. Yeah, I don't want to worry about annotating our stuff with our requests and responses with attributes, either data annotations or the data contract or data member attributes. The reason I don't want to do that is because buzzmmo.base is a .NET 3.5 class library by necessity, since it has to be loaded into Unity. And as a result, I don't want to depend on a different version of a class library that we might have another version loaded into our web application or our Photon application. So as a result, we will be doing manual authentication or manual validation against these properties, but fortunately we really only have 2 properties to deal with, so that'll be fairly trivial. Let's go ahead and write our auth validation response class. Our auth validation response is going to have a bool is valid, or credentials are valid. This will simply be a Boolean indicating whether the credentials were valid or not valid. So it's a very simple yes or no. Now let's create our auth generate token request class, taking a username and password, which of course that is not how you spell username. Username and password, both of these will be turned into properties, and they will be read-only. Then let's go ahead and create our auth generate token response class, which will have a bool is, or what was the boolean I used before on the other response? Credentials are valid. So we'll say credentials are valid and string token. Now we could of course add more stuff to this. We could also get a little fancy with the way we handle our responses, maybe write a generic type of some sort that will allow us to annotate all of our responses with like a collection of errors, a list of operation errors, validation messages, and all that fun stuff. But again, in the interest of keeping things simple and straightforward, I'm just going to be using booleans to indicate if the request was a success. I will also be using the HTTP status itself for that, or hopefully. I'm pretty sure you can send them. You better be able to do that. We'll see. It's an adventure. All right, so now we have our 4 classes, our inputs and our outputs for both of our actions. Let's jump back into our authentication controller and rework our signatures of these 2 methods to reflect our new classes. So the return type of validate credentials is going to be auth validate, auth validate, I want to make sure that this is not auth validation response. This should be auth validate response, just to keep it consistent with my input class. Then I'm going to pass in auth validation request, or auth validate request, and I'll call this request. In addition to doing this, I'm going to annotate this parameter with an attribute. The attribute I'm going to annotate it is with the attribute. The attribute I'm going to annotate this parameter with is called FromBody. Now, with the FromBody attribute, what this does is this instructs Web API that this data that I'm annotating should be parsed from the body of the request and not from the URL. Typically speaking, ASP.NET Web API is going to default to getting information from the route or from your query string. And we have to go ahead and tell it in some cases that we want to do something different. In this case, we want to establish or hydrate this class or this object from the body of our request, and our body will be written in JSON. So we want to make sure that we provide the FromBody attribute. As you see, if you read the documentation, it says an attribute that specifies that an action parameter comes only from the entire body of the incoming request message. There's a bit of language that's important here. It says comes only from the entire body. What that means is that the entire body is going to be stuffed into this one parameter, and that also means that we can only have one parameter on our action that is established from the body. If you want more complex parameters, then you would write a class or a wrapper class that would have more complex types as properties, and then ASP.NET Web API would populate those properties accordingly. So then we have return false at the end here. I'm just gonna remove that return statement entirely. I know it'll break the code. It's not going to compile yet, but it'll give us a nice, to-do to fix that. Generate token. Actually, no. I'm not going to. I'm going to leave generate token unimplemented for now, and let's do validate credentials first, just to show an end-to-end usage of our request response scheme, and also because when we get to generate token, I'm actually going to want to create a service layer or a service object for handling tokens. I don't want to stuff all of the logic in here because there is also related logic that's going to have to be used by our Photon server to consume a token. And so because of that, I'll want that code to be shared between our website and our Photon server. In order to do that, we have to put it in the data project. So we'll leave this unimplemented for now. Let's go ahead and work on our validate credentials. First of all, what we need is a database. So at the top, I'm going to say private read-only MMO database context. Eventually. MMO database context. There you go. MMO database context underscore database equals new MMO database context. Now the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to ensure that the username and the password are both present. So I'm going to say if not string is null or white space request username or not string is null or white space request password. Then we're going to want to return a new auth validate response of false. Unfortunately, I completely forgot a crucial detail to how we implement this using proper status codes. This is something that you don't have to really think about with ASP.NET MVC, since you're able to have some additional helper methods that help you out with returning particular status codes along with data. But in Web API, the problem is that when we have a return type of our API method that is a custom type, the only valid way to return from this is going to be with a HTTP status code of 200. However, if the username or password are incorrect, I really want to return a bad request status code and not a 200 OK status code. But I also want to send the serialized version of our response so that the code can be a little bit more straightforward on the client end. In order to do that, instead of returning a custom type, we can return a HTTP response message. And the HTTP response message will come from systemnet HTTP, which will be added up here at the top. And then what we do, instead of saying return new auth validation response, we're going to say return request.create response, passing in an HTTP status code of bad request, and then pass in a value of new auth validate response of false. So what we're doing is we're returning a HTTP response message. You'll also notice that we did get a new using statement up top when I did that. Resharper did that for me automatically. But by returning an HTTP response message, we have a lot more control about how we send back to our client, or data back to our client. And we're able to use this handy little helper method right here that'll allow us to override the HTTP status code to whatever we want, and it'll also allow us to pass in a custom object that'll be serialized appropriately and then deserialized on the other end. Okay, so at this point, we've ensured that they typed in a username and password for our API. Now let's go ahead and try to grab a user. So I'm going to say var user equals database.users. We'll say single or default, which of course will bring in system.link at the top. And I'll say single or default on t-username equals request.username. Then I'll say if user is null or not user check password request.password, then return request create request create response HTTP status code bad request new auth validation response false. Or actually, bad request might not be the best one. Let's pass in not authorized. Or, come on. Unauthorized is the proper status code for this. So, now that we've returned unauthorized there, I will go ahead and remove those curlies. Those are bugging me. Now at this point, we are sure that we have a user and his password is valid, so we can return request create response. I believe there's an overload where I can just pass in a value and it'll return a 200. Let's try that. It'll be an adventure. Auth validate response of true, because remember we're wanting to pass in true if they were properly authenticated. Now let's go ahead and click on create response and decompile this method. So I want to ensure that's going to be sending back a 200 OK, which it does. So that's what we want. And that is our validate credentials method. Let's go ahead and hit Control F5 to build and launch the application. Then let's fire up Postman and see about hitting this API. Because there's a couple interesting things about this API that we're going to need to be aware of. Okay, so let's fire up Postman. Now the endpoint is going to be API v1 authentication validate. We know that because we can see that we have a prefix of API v1 authentication and a action of validate. Oops. Okay, so now if we go ahead and hit send, it'll first say the requested resource does not support the HTTP method get. So let's go ahead and switch from get to post. Then let's hit send again. And it'll say object reference not set to an instance of an object. Okay, so what's happening here is that ASP.NET API or Web API can't populate this model. So it's setting it to null and it's letting the action continue. So what I'm going to do is at the top, I'll add a check for request does not equal null or any of those things. Or if request equals null, sorry, derp. I swear I can Boolean. Okay, so just make sure that it's not null so that we don't get a massive stack trace and a nasty ISE 500 if we do that. Okay, so what we get back is credentials are valid false, but we will also get back a request header indicating that we had a bad request. As we see right here, our status is bad request, which is what we want. It indicates to the client that they have a malformed request. So you might be thinking you should be able to do something like this, right? Username, admin, password, test, and hit send. Well, no. That's because the media type multi-part form data is not supported for this resource. Remember how we handled multi-part form data previously, particularly in our infrastructure upload service? How we had to create a multi-part form or multi-part data provider. We had to read as multi-part async and all that fun, horrible, terrible, annoying things. Well, that's because form data is a little bit of a pain to work with ASP.NET Web API, especially if you're mixing files with it. There are ways to coax it into working with form data efficiently or effectively, but what I prefer instead is to send JSON payloads. Unless I'm sending a file, I want to have this API be using JSON, where I put actual JSON into the post data, and then I have ASP.NET Web API automatically read that in, and then stuff it into this parameter, meaning I can write code in a very straightforward manner, and I can also make things very easy on the client too, because the client simply has to be able to serialize his objects into a JSON format. So coming back into Postman, how do we do that? Well, first of all, I'm going to open up my headers, and I'm going to pass in a header of content type of application/JSON. What this header indicates is that the body of my post request is going to contain JSON data. ASP.NET Web API is going to pick up on that fact and then use its JSON deserializer to populate this object that's going to be sent in as an argument to this method. So now that we've told ASP.NET Web API that we're working with JSON, I can jump over here to the raw tab, and I can say something like, I just write some JSON. By the way, you can click on this little drop down and select JSON, and you'll get like little syntax highlighting. It's kind of neat. I like Postman a lot. So let's say username equals whoa, password equals blah. And then let's hit send and see what happens. We get credentials are valid false. We get a bad request. So let's go ahead and that's really not what I wanted. I didn't want a bad request here. I wanted a unauthorized. So the bad request seems to be happening because it is not doing something right. So let's go ahead and set a breakpoint there, hit F5, and we can go ahead and debug this and see what's going on. Wait a year and a half. I'm going to come over to Postman on my other screen and hit send. And let's inspect request. We do indeed have a password and a username set, so notice that this object was properly formatted. But it's returning this. That's because request does not equal null. Oh, wow. Remember when I said I could Boolean? Well, apparently I can't. Because of that slight issue with the Boolean logic being inverted, it was being tripped up on this code path and returning a bad request. Let's go ahead and hit F6, recompile our application, jump back in here and hit send. Now I should get unauthorized eventually. Yep, we get a 401 unauthorized. Okay, so now we have that. The HTTP specification provides a bunch of stuff with using like different. Actually, 403 forbidden might be a more appropriate status code to set back. So let's type in that. Let's say HTTP status code forbidden. I need to reread the HTTP specification, honestly. All right, now we get a forbidden, and well, it says unauthorized response authenticating will make no difference, but the other one requires the use of a specific header. Whatever, it's good enough. No, it's not. I want unauthorized. It's my web service. I can use whatever HTTP status code I want. I love all the arguments about HTTP, and you should do this, or you should do that, or your URL should be like this, or your status code should be that. That amuses me. Anyway, let's go ahead and try to log in with the valid user. So I'll type in admin with the password of test, hit send, and we get credentials are valid is true. Okay, so that is our validate credentials method. We have one more method to write. It's going to be pretty straightforward. It's going to be very similar to some of the code that we've already written for our user service. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to jump all the way back to my data project, and I'm going to open up services, and I'm going to create a service for client authentication tokens. So I'm going to say client authentication token service. Now our service is going to accept a MMO database context database parameter, and it's going to have two methods on it. It's going to have one method for generate token for a user, and it's going to have another method for consuming a token. So let's go ahead and say public, let's just say public string generate token for user. So what we're going to do is we are going to go ahead and generate that token for the user and then add it to the user. And then before we do that, of course, we have to make sure that the user doesn't have any other tokens on him, delete all of his existing ones, and words and stuff. So do all that. Let's go ahead and first delete all of the tokens that a user might already have on him. So I'm going to say for each var existing token in database client authentication tokens where, now this will bring in a using statement for system.link at the top, where user equals user, and then I'm going to say database client authentication tokens dot remove existing token. There's actually a better way to write this code. It turns out that there is a remove range method. Let's see what its signature looks like. Let's do database client authentication tokens remove range. It looks like it takes in an IEnumerable of client authentication tokens. So I suppose we could clean this for each loop up simply by passing in database client authentication tokens where user equals user. And I think this second line here looks a lot cleaner than having this for each loop. So let's go ahead and remove that for each loop. So we remove all of the authentication tokens that a user currently has. Then let's go ahead and generate one. So I'm going to go ahead and say var token equals new client authentication token. I'm going to pass in a created at of datetime dot UTC now. I'm going to pass in a request IP. I don't actually have that as a parameter yet for my generate token 4, so I'm going to do that right now. I'm actually going to have that be the first parameter. So I just added a string parameter to my containing method called request IP. Then I will want the user to equal user. Now after I've done that, I want to go ahead and generate the token itself. So I'm going to be pretty much mimicking the code I already have in my user entity. If we come down here to our generate random token method, we'll just basically be lifting that for use over here. So I'm going to say using var random equals new RNG crypto service provider. We'll create a 32-byte buffer. We'll say random get non-zero bytes for buffer. And then we'll say token.token equals convert.toBase64 string buffer. Then finally at the end of this, we'll say database client authentication tokens.add token. And then we'll make sure to call database save changes. And the final thing we'll do is return token.token. So that will return the token back to the caller so that the API can send the token back to the user. So let's go ahead and jump back into our authentication controller and jump into our generate token method. So it's pretty much going to mimic our validate credentials method for the most part. I could have abstracted this out into another method, but it won't really hurt to type it out again. The first thing we do is we want to make sure our return type is HTTP response message. Again, we do this because this return type gives us the most flexibility. We can return file data, we can return string data, we can return URL encoded data, we can return JSON data, XML data, and we can override headers, we can override the status code. This particular return type just gives us a lot more flexibility, so that's what we'll be using in this case. Next up, we have to put in our parameter. Our parameter will be auth generate token request, called request, and we'll make sure to annotate it with the from body attribute to indicate to Web API that we want it to try to hydrate this parameter from the body of our request. Then we'll do our basic validation. I'll say if request is null or string is null or white space request dot username or string is null or white space request password, then return, oops, that's not how you spell return, return request with an uppercase R dot create response HTTP, oh come on, HTTP status code dot bad request, returning a new auth generate token response, passing in false for credentials are valid and passing in null for my token. Then let's try to get the user from the database. So I'm going to say var user equals database dot single or default, or sorry, users dot single or default. And we'll query on username equals request. Oh, come on, ReSharper. You're not going to do this to me right now, are you? Request. There we go. Username. And I'll say if user equals null or not user check password, lowercase user, check password, request.password, then return request. Oh, come on. There, no. There we go. Create response, unauthorized, and a new generate token response, passing in false for credentials are valid and passing in null for our token. After we've done that, we'll want to go ahead and instantiate our token service and then return the generated token back to the user. So I'm going to say var token service equals new client authentication token service, which of course that'll bring in a using statement for my services namespace up here. And then it has one parameter for its constructor for database. Then I'm going to say return request.create response, and then I'm going to pass in new auth generate and we're frozen. Lovely. There we go. New auth generate token response. Passing in true for credentials are valid, and passing in token service dot generate token for with the request IP and the user we retrieve. And of course, remember that to acquire the IP address of a client, we have to do some nasty logic. I'm going to break that out into another line. I'm going to say var request IP equals, I'm going to say HTTP context wrapper. This will bring in a using statement for system.web. Request.properties ms underscore HTTP context dot request dot user host address. Then on my generate token for method, I will pass in request IP and the user entity that we want to create a token for. All right, let's go ahead and test it. Hit F6. Jump into Postman. Instead of hitting our validate, we'll hit our login. And I'll hit send. And we get an error. Unable to create a constant value of type. Only primitive types or enumerations are supported in this context. Well, that's a weird thing to say. Let's go ahead and take a look at the stack trace. See if we can track down this issue. Pulling up the stack trace, we have an error right there. It really doesn't like that. It says unable to create a constant value of user. Weird. Yeah, this is just a difference between nhibernate and Entity Framework, I suppose. In nhibernate, I'm used to using their link provider, being able to do equality operations between different entities. Apparently, that's not the case with Entity Framework. So instead of comparing user to user, I'll say user.id to user.id. That way we're comparing against two primitive values rather than comparing the object references themselves, which Entity Framework seems incapable of being able to decode. Let's hit F6, jump back into Postman, and hit send. Wait a year and a half. And we get credentials are valid true, and we do indeed get a nice little token. Let's go ahead and hop into our database and see what was added to it. Jump in here, do a select, we get a user ID, we get a created at, we get a request IP, and we get a token. And that's all the information we need. Let's jump back into Postman and hit send a couple more times, generating different tokens every time. And let's jump back into MySQL and make sure that we're not getting multiple tokens, and we aren't. Let's go ahead and create another user and then try to log in with him. Go to our admin, users. Let's grab nlac3. I'm going to reset his password to test. And then on Postman, I'm going to say a username of nlac3, password of test, hit send. We do get our token back, and if we check to see, we do indeed have another entry. Let's test our validation real fast. If I don't supply a password, I get a bad request. If I do supply a password, but it's the wrong password, I should get an unauthorized, which I do. Now there's one last thing that we need to do. We need to make sure that users can only log in if they're in a role that the game is enabled for. To do that check, we just need to jump back into our authentication controller, instantiate our settings service, and make sure that those, after we've established that we can get the user, we'll want to instantiate our settings service and ensure that the user can indeed log into the game. So on validate credentials, above create response, we'll say var settings service, and we'll say equals new buzz what did I call it? I can't even remember what I called it. MMO settings service. MMO settings service, of course, requires a database. And I'll say if not settings service dot is game enabled for user. Actually, I can. Yeah, I'm going to take the settings service instantiation and I'm going to move it above the user. And then I'm just going to combine it into this one if statement. So I'm going to say if user is null, meaning the user wasn't found, or the user's password is wrong, or not settings service dot is game enabled for user, then return unauthorized. Then we'll do the same up here. Above, after we instantiate or before we instantiate the user, we'll create our settings service equals new MMO settings service, passing in our database connection. Then on our if statement up here, we'll say or not settings service dot is game enabled for user. All right, let's go ahead and hit F6 and see if we can lock out our users. So I'm going to drag over the thing right here. Let's go to Postman. Let's hit send. This should return a 200. Which will after a year and a half. It does. Let's go ahead and NLAC3 is, what groups is he a part of? NLAC3 is registered. So let's go into our settings and disallow registered. Come back here and hit send. And we get a 401 unauthorized. Let's go ahead and turn off everything but beta testers, go into NLAC3 and add him to beta testers. Come back here to Postman, hit send, and we get credentials are valid. So now we have a way of locking out our users. We can certainly be a little bit more granular with our error messages and present a different error if their credentials are valid and they are allowed into the game. We can worry about that distinction later. Yeah, we'll worry about that in a different video once we get the launcher going. So we can display just a slightly different error message depending on what condition it was that they failed logging into as. I don't know if that sentence was properly constructed or not, but hopefully you guys get the idea. All right, so in this video, what we did is we implemented a couple different methods, or a couple different classes, I should say. We created our client authentication token entity and added it to the database. We created our client authentication token service. At least one of the methods. We'll be writing the other method for consuming an authentication token when we need it. And then we finished our authentication controller, which of course required that we provided strongly typed requests and responses so that interacting with this API is considerably easier. So I think this just about wraps up this video. We'll see you guys in the next one.